Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to the Socialist History Society. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a bit of a long introduction to Aldridge himself, a bit of a biography. And then I'm going to talk about his philosophy and about how that figures in his novels. I'm not going to mention a lot of novels, but I'll mention what I can in the time. And I just wanted to say also by way of introduction that my interest in Aldridge began by reading what I still believe to be his best political novel, The Diplomat. But as I read more, my interest was piqued because I slowly became aware of something that wasn't immediately apparent from his novels, that he was also a serious and active proponent of Marxism. Because he wrote political pieces also for World Marxist Review and for Labour Monthly in particular, we can sort of track his own developments as a Marxist as post-war history unfolded. And I think that they give us a picture, it's indicative maybe of a certain type of communist whose story is less commonly told, but deserves attention as part of an overall picture of post-war history. So in 1987, James Aldridge won the Guardian Children's Fiction Award for the true story of Spit McPhee. And a profile of him in the Guardian noted that the judges were shocked to find that the winner is well known everywhere but in Britain. His native Australia had only just begun to recognise him with an award for another children's book. And the profile noted that he might have slipped from view because he is a Marxist who has always fought for peace. And it seems this year is a good year to commemorate him as a fighter for peace. 70 years ago, in 1953, he won the World Peace Council Award precisely for The Diplomat. And 50 years ago, in 1973, he won the Gold Medal International Lenin Peace Prize. Quote, in recognition of the power of James Aldridge's pen and the importance of his activities in the service of strengthening peace, mutual understanding, friendship and cooperation among the peoples. And I think it's just worth reminding ourselves that in the world of 1970s socialism, this was an incredibly prestigious prize. And other recipients included Angela Davis, Paul Robeson, Pablo Neruda, Bertolt Brecht, J.D. Bernal in another area of work. Now, Aldridge told the Times when he received the Lenin Peace Prize that my politics are mainly in my books. And of course, my books have mainly been about war and diplomacy, starting from an anti-Nazi position during the war. In his speech accepting the prize, he said that it was a writer's duty to struggle openly against the forces of reaction and war. And in 1987, in the last article he wrote for World Marxist Review, he said that the literary tradition from which he first belonged was writers who hated war. Okay, so I'm going to start with a brief biography, and I'm going to just go and share my screen if I can. Yes, okay. So these are pictures of Aldridge. The very young Aldridge as a war correspondent, a more mature Aldridge, and an older Aldridge as well. So I think I can go to the next one. Okay, so he was born in 1918 in Bendigo, Australia, Victoria. And there's Melbourne, there's Southern Australia, there's Bendigo. And then his family, I think, moved fairly quickly after he was born to Swan Hill. Now, in the 1930s, this was a very small town with about 3,500 inhabitants. It was bush country, and it was on the Great Murray River. And his reports leading a rather Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer sort of boyhood, full of swimming, horses, whatever else you did on the banks of a river. And it was in the Australian bush country. He was the youngest of 5 children born to English parents. His father had been a lay Methodist preacher, but became the editor of a local paper. So Aldridge grew up in a fairly conservative middle-class family. He wasn't interested in going to university, and at 16, he moved to Melbourne, where he became a copy boy on the Melbourne Sun Herald, which was part of the original Murdoch empire, owned by Rupert Murdoch's father. Rupert Murdoch's father, Keith. Keith Murdoch very much encouraged bright young men, including at one point, in fact, Wilfrid Burchett, if that name rings a bell. One of the journalists on Murdoch's, and I should sort of say that Aldridge remembers the young Rupert Murdoch being brought to the offices with his nursemaid. And one of the journalists on Murdoch's Herald recalls that nearly all of us were left-wing, and we glowed with hate for Mussolini and the up-and-coming Hitler. We read such books as John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World and Sholokov's And Quiet Flows the Don. Every one of us, I suspect, was secretly planning or already working on a novel. It was also in Melbourne that Aldridge was exposed to the Marxism, which became the guiding motif of his life and work. He arrived in London in 1939 and worked freelance for various London papers. And in this role, when war broke out, he went to Scandinavia, and he was in Finland a few days before the Soviet invasion in November 1939. And he was therefore one of the very first reporters there, and his reports quickly brought him to the attention of all the major papers. He openly admired the Red Army. He predicted its victory in Finland. And as the Finnish defeat loomed, Mannerheim, who was the commander-in-chief of the Finnish forces, expelled him. He went to Norway when the Nazis invaded. He covered the Allied retreat from Greece and Crete, the campaigns in the Western Desert, and the Allied occupation of Syria. And by this time, he became an official war correspondent and wore the uniform. By 1942, when he was just 24, he had actually become something of a celebrity himself, and reports circulated in newspaper articles of his opinions and his doings. He even had an entry in 1943 as a very young man in the US National Dictionary of Current Biography. Between 1944 and 1945, he was based in Moscow, and he followed the Soviet troops across Ukraine and Poland, and I think into Germany. He was in the first group of journalists taken around Majdanek, the liberation camp, the concentration camp, and he was later to refer to that experience as the worst day of his life. After the war, I think he basically turned to full-time writing. I want to, can I go on to the next slide? Sorry. Oh, this is the Murray River in Swan Hill. And in 1942, when he met and married his wife, Dina. He met her in Egypt, and she was an Egyptian and also an active journalist in her own right. And this is Dina and him at some conference, I think somewhere in the Soviet Union. They settled mainly in Britain, in Battersea, and they had 2 children. They spent long periods in Egypt and frequent stays in the Soviet Union. I think a little bit like Jack Lindsay. He was an incredibly popular writer in the Soviet Union, perhaps one of the most popular Western writers. And of course, he had to spend his royalties somehow, and he had to spend them in the Soviet Union. He also won the medal of the International Organization of Journalists in 1972, and other literary prizes and nominations. And I want to sort of just quickly summarize his output. I'll go through it so that you can see some of it. He wrote 24 novels, 13 of which I'm going to call them political, and 11 of which are about childhood. A few are written directly for children, and the rest are sort of more for young adults, but are equally, and they were always commended for being equally interesting for adults. Looking at these lists, one of the things I wanted to point out, I put in red what was filmed, and several of them were filmed. But I've also put in green, don't know if you can see the green, books which are actually, and short stories which are actually for children. Many of his childhood novels were about growing up in a small town that he called St. Helen, but was actually referring to Swan Hill. And I just want to show you, as time went on, increasingly the number of green books that I've put down here increases. Increasingly, he turned to writing children's fiction. So by the time you come to his last books, many of which he was writing when he was getting quite old, he died in 2015, it's all children's books. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the end. He also wrote non-fiction. He wrote a book about hunting fish. And he also wrote a biography of Cairo, the biography of a city, which if ever I go to Cairo, I'm going to take with you. It's a very interesting book. What he does is he mentally strips back all the buildings of Cairo, and then he rebuilds it in layers with the different history and the different builders as they came along till you arrive at the modern Cairo. And he was in quite a lot of demand. He wrote the introductions and prefaces to several other works. His books are full of action and adventure, and I think that's why he was part of the reason why he was so popular in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and some of them got filmed. As a person, he seems to have been a very popular figure. He was described as dashing and well-informed. He was a qualified and experienced pilot. He was a yachtsman, a sea diver, a horseman. And I think this technical knowledge provided some of the realism of his work. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Come back to. So Aldridge said in 1960, talking about his philosophy, he said to a fellow Australian writer that my philosophy as a writer begins with my philosophy to life itself. I am a Marxist, and this is my point of view and always has been since I was 16 anyway. To have the right philosophy hardly means a thing if you don't have the real respect, the deliberate approach to the craft itself. And I think in the 1930s in Melbourne, this is where he really picked up his Marxism, and he pays a full due to a man called Charles Clifford, who was the father of one of his friends and working class and a communist, who debated with Aldridge very intensely and set him reading lists on political economy, literature and Marxism. And that Charles Clifford appears in the first of his young adult books, My Brother Tom. And a character called Hans Dreiser, interestingly enough, referring obviously to Theodore Dreiser, seems to have the same relationship to the eponymous Tom of the title as Aldridge had to Clifford. Hans Dreiser, we are told, offered Tom the possibility to reconstruct the whole world by exposing the rot and by removing ignorance and class exploitation. And I think that that is at the centre of Aldridge's outlook. He was not an academic Marxist, but he appears to be extremely well versed in Marxism and kept abreast of new developments in Marxism. He was a friend of the American editor Angus Cameron, who influenced his actual form of writing, he said, and he described him as making his Marxism the key to his deep understanding of literature and life. Fundamental to his outlook is materialism and reality. And he wrote an article on the politics of morality in which he said that Marx has given us a scientific understanding of our condition and a new morality, which for the first time defined good and bad as part of the historical development of necessity. There are no rival gods in Marxism, no abstract dogmas or codas. And I think this idea, this materialism in his book, the reality, is worked through especially in a book called The Hunter, which he wrote, I think, in 1951, set among the remaining fur trappers in the Ontario wilds, in which he contrasts the materialist and the idealist approach to the morality of trapping hunters and to the environment in general. In the 1960s and 1970s, he opposed what we now know as the Frankfurt School. The Marxists, he said, had tried to neutralize the essential class elements in politics. In 1968, he expressed concern that the students in Paris were unrealistically expecting workers to take to the streets in defense of individual liberty and student revolutionary intellectual abstractions. And that view was echoed in a 1974 book, a 1974 novel, Mockery in Arms. His attitude towards the Soviet Union, the fundamental attitude, was a constant defense of what was called at the time actually existing socialism. And I think this core belief derived from three elements. First of all was his admiration for the Red Army, as he observed it operating during the Second World War as a war correspondent. He often remarked how the Red Army soldiers are actually better disciplined and more deadly serious about this war than the troops of any other nation. And there was a sense of urgency in everything they did, particularly compared with what he observed with the British. Secondly, he had a huge admiration for the Soviet attitude towards culture. And he often noted the sheer number of books and Western novels published there, and the high level of cultural knowledge and engagement among the people. And this, to him, this cultural engagement was the most important gauge of social progress. And finally, he saw it as a counterweight to the US and imperialism in general. And as a result of his time in Greece, in Egypt and Persia during and after the war, he was a very committed anti-colonialist. He has one devastating attack in a political article of his on the US bombing campaign against Cambodia in 1969. And I think that support made him deeply skeptical of anti-Soviet positions, of claims that the West had a monopoly on freedom and democracy, whether those views were expressed in the West, among Marxists, or through protests in socialist countries themselves. But I think his main concern was for peace and understanding and East-West dialogue. And in these courses, he was active and he was vocal. In the early 1950s, he shared platforms with J.D. Bernal, D.N. Pritt, Hewlett Johnson, as they spoke up and down the country on behalf of the Stockholm peace petition. And he later supported the Helsinki peace process. He was on committees for democracy in Greece and for the recognition of the GDR. He attended many writers' conferences in the GDR and the Soviet Union, and he was at the 1973 World Congress of Peace Forces in Moscow, where he chaired the Commission on Cooperation in Education and Culture. In the 1980s, I understand he attended demonstrations in Greenham and other places where US bases were. So how does this approach come into his books? Well, Ralph Fox once said that writing is a philosophical occupation. And I think the ideas and the debates that emerge in his writings are one of his distinctive features. And I have to say that sometimes they keep you going, what can be quite long and rather complex later political novels. I'm going to come back to sharing my screen. If I yeah. Okay. Because he made a statement about his writing at one point. He said, "Each of my books deals in some way with the choice that everyone faces at this moment in history. Each of my books can be considered part of a continuing series called The Human Choice." Obviously, a sort of hark back to Balzac and his trilogy, The Human Comedy. And Balzac was very much admired by Marxists in their 1930s writing. He says, "I believe that the decisive actions of people, including the individual, determine the survival or demise of mankind itself." Basically, what he's saying is here, men make their own history, but they make their choices at specific moments in history, that is, under conditions which are not of their own choosing. So it's straight Marxism. So I want to make a few quick points about the features of his novels. First of all, they are realist. They're very realist. They are given a context which is very, very specific. The times and places that he himself knew. They are not about working class socialist heroes. They're about people the people that he mixed with, diplomats, newspapers men. They're about soldiers. They're about soldiering, and they're about the British upper class. Events are often set in Greece. They're set in Greece, the Western Desert during the war, Iran in 1946, Egypt before the Suez Crisis, and of course, small town Australia. His technique is to insert fictional characters into these actual times and places, and we encounter real historical figures. We encounter Stalin and Molotov in The Diplomat, General Nasser in The Last Exile. In Australia, we encounter what's often thought to be his own father, and certainly the communist I mentioned, Charles Clifford. I think the second feature is that the subject matter, I think, is enhanced, the realism is enhanced by his skills as a war correspondent. And I think that often gives an immediacy and a realism to fictional work. Thirdly, the content of his novels. What is it? It's anti-fascist, it's anti-colonialist, it's for the cause of national liberation. It's for the cause of détente in the Soviet Union in two of his novels, A Captive in the Land and The Statesman Game, and also in a children's book, The Marvelous Mongolian. A fourth feature is a presentation of debates. His characters are puzzled, they're troubled, they're forever seeking answers from a variety of sources. And he takes us through these different places where they have different observations and different questions to ask. And I think this means that the books are not didactic. At times, Aldridge draws the reader's attention to a specific point, but sort of in the way that Engels described what a socialist novel should be like. He provides an account which sort of leaves the reader to make their own deductions to a certain extent. And finally, I think one of Aldridge's tricks is that the reader sort of catches a glimpse of the future. Aldridge and or particularly his characters, can only guess at the future, but we sort of pick it up. And one reviewer later says of Aldridge that he had the ability to detect the shoots of new phenomena. And finally, character and the development of character is the central point. They're quite psychological. Now, Aldridge admired E.M. Forster. And Forster said that the power of the novel, as distinct from other forms of art, had the power to make the secret life visible, the secret life of the mind visible. Aldridge does this, and his characters move through the historical panorama as they finally decide what they're going to do. And The Diplomat, to my mind, shows these attributes the most successfully. I'll talk about that for a little bit. I'll come back and stop sharing the screen for a bit. Right. It's set against the Iran crisis of 1946, which is often seen as the first flashpoint of the Cold War. And in November 1946, I think it's worth remembering that Truman had declared his aim of getting tough with the Soviets. This is a time when America had the atom bomb, and of course the Soviet Union didn't. Well, under a 1942 treaty, British and Soviet troops occupied Iran to secure a pro-Allied government there, to secure the oil resources and a supply route of Lend-Lease supplies to Russia. The treaty provided for both sides to withdraw 6 months after the end of the war. But then in September 1945, there was a popular revolt in Iranian Azerbaijan, and in December 1945 in Iranian Kurdistan, and autonomous people's republics were set up there. And the novel turns on the origin of these two revolts. Were they the result purely of the Russian occupation of northern Iran, or was it really part of the inevitable opposition that would arise to the poverty and the brutality suffered under what was British-backed and essentially a sort of semi-feudal society and state? So the diplomat of the title is a Lord Essex, and he's on a mission to Moscow. He's suave, he's cultured, yet he's also, as the novel shows, he's able to look on torture really without turning a hair. He's arrogant, but he's also vulnerable, particularly in his dealings with the female interest. He has no doubt in his mind that the aim of his mission is to get the Russians out of Azerbaijan and to restore the Tehran government's authority. Well, he chooses this young Scot, MacGregor, to accompany him. Well, MacGregor is rather bookish and introverted. He's a paleontologist working for an oil company in Iran, and he's lived in Iran for much of his life. He knows and understands Iran, its culture, and he knows its languages. One is rather worldly, the other is unworldly. And MacGregor is basically a foil to Essex, and his background and sort of diplomatic wiliness can't understand and even can't outwit MacGregor's integrity. Well, MacGregor gradually becomes aware, he's a bit of an innocent, he gradually becomes aware that Essex's purpose when they go from Moscow on a fact-finding mission to Iran, that his purpose is to seek out those forces who can be bribed or co-opted to British policy. But what MacGregor sees is a desperately poor, brutalized country. Actual reports from Iran at the time, and it's portrayed also in the novel, see a nation in rags. 99% of the land was in the hands of absentee landlords, while in some villages, 90% of the people had malaria and infant mortality was over 50%. It's quite a long book. Back in Britain, Essex is appointed special British delegate to the UN Security Council, a Security Council meeting that actually did take place. And the papers report that he would present his opinion there. And his opinion was, authoritatively, that there was damning and conclusive evidence of Russia's guilt in creating revolt in Azerbaijan. Well, over the course of this odyssey that MacGregor undertakes, and I think all of Aldridge's books tend to involve a character going through an odyssey, MacGregor realizes that the side he thought he was on is at odds with his knowledge and his observations of real conditions. And still more gradually, he realizes that he has no option but to act on those convictions, whatever the personal consequences, and against all he was brought up to believe. And he writes a letter to the Times describing the revolts in the two republics as genuine and locally inspired, and calling attention to decades of direct British control in Iran, and therefore the dishonesty of British policy. So we learn a lot from history from this book. It's quite interesting what happens here. I mean, Gorky talked about literature as the travelling companion of history, and that's almost what we get in The Diplomat. We're shown the violence of a semi-feudal system. We meet representative types of the forces behind Mossadegh's election in 1951, poor peasants, oil workers, revolutionary soldiers. And we see the machinations of Essex and others, which perhaps foreshadow the forces behind the coup against Mossadegh in 1953, which, as we now know, was orchestrated by British and US intelligence. And of course, the World Peace Council Prize was awarded to Essex, to Aldridge in 1953. And I think also that Aldridge is working through a very basic, but also quite a sophisticated Marxist concept, which is not an easy one to understand. And MacGregor acts, I would say, Aldridge is arguing, he acts freely because he grasps the necessity of the act. It's a thing that Ralph Fox talks about, that all the Marxist literary critics talk about, the debate, the relationship between freedom and necessity. If he is to maintain his own self-respect, he has to act, and if he's not to betray his own sense of justice. And his social disgrace, which follows from his act, becomes in a way his personal honour. So I want to turn as well to his childhood novels and his young adult novels, which are on the theme of social justice also. As we've seen in his later life, these completely superseded his political novels. And they're essentially a series of what can be called Bildungsromane, novels about a child's development. And he explores the child's and his or her society's quest to secure a life in which a child can grow and flourish. Well, unlike the adults in the political novels, the children lack the ability to articulate their own needs, and they have to express their actions, they have to express their feelings through action. If we take Spit McPhee, which is a book for which he won the prize, the Guardian Prize, rather than go to a children's home that one adult wants to send him to, he runs away and lives wild. But the adult world has to make the decisions. Sorry, I just want to share my screen again, if I can. Yeah, I can. I think, I'm not sure if I've got, sorry. I might just go back. No, sorry, I'll just go back. I had a few other slides. I just suddenly thought I should be showing, but sorry. Okay. But the adult world that has to make these decisions about various children is divided. It might be divided along religious lines or class lines, and it's bigoted. We have small town Australia in the 1930s. And so often, and in Spit McPhee as well, the future of the child is decided through the law and through a courtroom. And this is actually rather a favourite device of Aldridge because it allows debates to come out. And in Spit McPhee, what Aldridge does is that he poses the religious bigotry and the social snobbery of one group of adults who think the child should, that his wildness needs to be contained, and the best way of containing it is sending him to a children's home. And he poses it against, well, one side sees Spit McPhee as wild, as rude, as obstinate, it has a very negative view of him and his background, but nevertheless wants to do something about it. And Aldridge poses that against the reality, the truth of Spit McPhee's life, the deprivation, his orphanhood, the fact he was brought up by his grandfather under very difficult circumstances. And this and other stories about St Helen, I think, are deliberately called the true story of Spit McPhee, the true story of Lily Stubeck, because he's trying to get at the truth, at reality. Aldridge had said of morality in relation to Marxism, there is only reality and the understanding of reality and the true use of reality to correct cruelties and failures. And I think in Spit McPhee and other books, it's the understanding of reality, of the truth, that provides a sort of moral solution, which allows for cruelties and errors to be corrected. And the second point, I think, that emerges for me from the children's book is a point made by one critic, that Aldridge seeks to answer an old question of how people ought to live in communities. Because at the end of the novel, Spit McPhee realises and recognises he has to go along with certain adult rules, with the society in St Helen as it is. But in the end, he's only willing to do so because the solution the court finds for him, which is fostering by a kindly and understanding family, has clearly offered him something in return, which is his own somehow instinctive recognition that through that he can himself grow. Aldridge effectively argues in a political article he wrote much later in the 1980s he says it's argued really it's no surprise if young people rebel and become antisocial when society offers them nothing. But I want also to ask, well, what explains Aldridge's shift in focus towards children's stories? Aldridge himself said that the distance of 3 decades was needed before he felt he could tackle that time in his life in Australia. But I think it's also interesting to ask, what did he want younger children to get from these books? I hope I'm not running out of time, am I? Nearly. The earliest of them was My Brother Tom, which was published in 1966. It's set in St Helen before the war, and it's narrated by Tom's brother. Tom's brother is a trainee journalist at the time, but he's now grown up and he's looking back at the 1930s. And at the end of the book, and he's looking back at his brother and his brother's history, brother Tom's history. At the end of the book, the narrator expresses a hope that the next generation can overcome, quote, the awful bigotry of dead morals, the violence of violent systems, and the corruption of a life lived without meaning. I think this is partly what the books are hoping they might achieve. And the narrator's preface to My Brother Tom, I think, is very revealing. I think it probably is Aldridge speaking. He says, and this is written in 1966, we are no longer an admirable generation. That seems clear. Though we did fight in the war, we simply fell apart when a handful of frightened men cried treason at us after the war. We abandoned too easily what we knew was right, yet the values we had acquired in our youth are just as good now as we were then, only we failed to hand them on. I wonder here whether we get a sense of a dissipation of the hopes that perhaps all communists had nurtured in those victorious days at the end of the Second World War. I think by the 1970s, Aldridge was disappointed, in particular with the left. He had seen nothing in the 1968 student rebellions. He saw it as a search for individual liberty rather than social justice. And he said in 1971 in one of his articles, you can't look at the world today and feel that the choice is at all clear and easy. It gets more difficult to find the right way. He talks more and more of the violence of capitalism, and faced with the new arms race in the early 1980s, he effectively reissues a call to writers to be a mighty instrument for peace. And he says it doesn't have to be a literature of peace with a capital P, it simply has to be the literature of life itself, against death and against those who deal in death. And I don't want to overstate this, but I think Aldridge was a very robust, almost like robust Marxist. It was simply that his very robust view on reality, his ability to face reality, meant that he was recognizing that what was needed was a still greater search for solutions. So very quickly, just to conclude, Aldridge was he's an intelligent, widely read, and I think a very sensitive author. And I think we might agree or disagree with his political views, but I think he should not be cancelled. He needs to be looked at, he needs to be read, because otherwise we deny ourselves some very valuable insights that he manages to achieve.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation of Aldridge and his work and his ideas. Are there any questions or comments? I don't see anything in the chat at the moment. While people are formulating questions, I'd just like to ask, was Aldridge published in the Soviet Union sort of entirely in Russian translation, or was he also used as an author for students who were trying to learn English? Because that was always a problem in the Soviet Union, having suitable literature for people who had, mastered English up to a certain level, which there were a fair number. So, do you have any information on that?
He was published in, I think, pretty well every language in the Soviet Union. I don't know if he was published in English as well. I would suspect that he was. He was incredibly popular. I mean, one writer says that he was the most popular Western writer, one of the most popular Western writers in the Soviet Union. I mean, not just British, but Western, which I think is fairly remarkable. And I also know that they literally published something like 2 million prints. But I don't know if he was published in English as well. I suspect he probably was. Yeah, but I don't know the answer. Sorry. Be interesting to find out.
Okay, thanks, Helen. First, Brian Dempsey, then Sarah. If you can unmute yourself, please, Brian.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Interesting. I hadn't heard of the author. Two questions. One, was he in any way troubled or confused when he arrived from Australia to Europe? I think you said in 1939 in Finland, by the Hitler-Stalin pact, because you said he was praising of the Red Army, but I mean that was in a if I understood the timeline that you were saying correctly, that was not at the time when the Soviet Union was fighting the Nazis. It was the time when the Soviet Union was in the pact with the Nazis. So did coming from Australia and finding the reality of the Soviet Union's political leadership, did that disorientate him at all? And then why on earth would he be cancelled? You seem to throw that in. You threw it in the last sentence. We should read him. He mustn't be cancelled. And I just wondered, is there some sort of campaign to cancel him? Because I not only have I not heard of him, I haven't heard of any campaign to cancel him either.
Okay, on the Hitler-Stalin pact, I couldn't tell you definitively. What I can tell you is that from what it's quite difficult to get all of his. You have to realise he wasn't at this time writing these political statements in World Marxist Review or whatever that you can really definitively see his ideas. So, but from his correspondence, from his reports from Finland, and yes, absolutely, it was during the Soviet Nazi pact, and it was also, but it was also when the Finns were opposed to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had invaded Finland. And the first reports coming out of Finland were, and of course, when the Soviet Union was not doing well, were very well, I mean, the reports I've seen were sort of like really focused a lot on the terrible things that were happening to the Soviet soldiers. But he was, as the situation in Finland, but in the Finnish campaign shifted, he began to see the Red Army operating in a very, very sustained and impressive way. And in 1941, he was asked, he did I think he was, when he was invalided out from Syria, he was asked by an Australian paper what he thought of the Soviet Union coming into the war. And he said, in 1941, as the Soviet Union was retreating, he said, the Red Army will win, the Soviet Union will win. But what he thought about the Hitler-Stalin Pact, I do not know. All one can get are his reports as a war correspondent. That's all I've got to go on. No, there was no campaign to cancel him, as far as I'm aware. But he was a bestseller in the early days. You know, you read the reviews of him, of his early books, Signed with His Honor as Sea Eagle, The Diplomat, of Many Men, right into the 50s and the 60s. He was a bestseller, and he begins to sort of disappear from view, basically. And it might be, you know, he's old. But I think, you know, the judges themselves in 1987 were shocked. How come we've never heard of him? And I think you do hear of other Australian writers. We do know of, you know, other people who have been, and I don't know if he was ever even a communist. I don't know if he was a member of the Communist Party. I don't know. I've got no evidence one way or the other. But, you know, you do hear of other authors. They have got a lot of fame. And I think my point is simply, well, something's happened here. But obviously there's no actual campaign. I suppose I use the term cancel because it is a thing today. Just as I use it as a shorthand, really, basically, Brian. Yeah, probably not necessarily a good one, but I used it as a shorthand.
Okay, thanks, Helen. Can I bring in now Sarah Mercer, followed by Pat Devine? So Sarah.
Okay, thank you. My comment really is that I am almost certain that Aldridge was published in English in the Soviet Union, because my first knowledge of him was when I was visiting on a tour in the mid-70s, and the guide, who had an immense knowledge of English literature in English, talked to me about James Aldridge.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sarah.
Okay, thanks for that. Pat, would you like to come in? Unmute yourself, please. Pat, we can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed your talk, Helen. What I'm wondering is, when I first read The Diplomat, which admittedly was a long time ago, my sense of it now is that it focused on the Kurdish issue and the role that Stalin played in resolving that issue. Now, I may have the wrong book, and so I may have got that wrong. But if it's the right book, I just wondered what you know about how he thought about his characterization of Stalin and the role he played, given the subsequent revelations about Stalin. So that's really what I'm interested in.
Stalin really only comes into the novel when he comes in very, very briefly. They're in Moscow. Essex is Essex is quite a sort of pushy type, and this is Lord Essex, the diplomat of the title, and the Soviet attitude towards Essex is, look, this is nothing to do with us, and it's you know, the focus of that novel is more about Azerbaijan. Kurdistan is the focus of the mockery in arms. That's the focus of Kurdistan, of where Kurdistan comes in. Although the Kurds are there as well, Azerbaijan tends to be more the focus, although obviously the two were of concern. But Stalin and Molotov's attitude in the book is trying to this is a problem. You have a problem with the governments of Azerbaijan and Iran, and this is a problem with the Iranians. You have an issue with the Iranians, not with us. Why are you coming to us? We have simply occupied that part of Iran to secure supplies and to secure oil. And that tends to be their view. Don't come to us to try and resolve this. It's, you know, go and talk to the government of Iran about this. I would have said they come in so fleetingly that it'd be difficult to sort of say what sort of attitude he had towards Stalin and Molotov. They're certainly not portrayed in a hostile way. And you have to remember, this was written in 1949. The book was written in 1949. They're certainly not portrayed in a hostile way. They're portrayed as, and also they change their view. So I mean, Essex, first of all, gets nowhere. And then in fact, it's a young MacGregor who thinks, maybe we can solve this problem, maybe we can reach some compromise by going on a fact-finding mission. And I think he's hoping that will, you know, somehow out of that will somehow emerge a solution. And at first but they need some sort of Soviet agreement to that, because the Soviets are occupying it, and they need some sort of safe passage. And that's what I think Stalin and Molotov at first are not interested in, then agree. I'm sorry, that's not necessarily the answer you're looking for, but I think that's as far as I can go.
Thanks, Helen. Any further questions? Jan?
Yeah, thanks very much.
Time. And also, I think sometimes, you know, comrades forget, especially full-timers, that
So we lost. Everything's gone quiet. Something horrible happened to the connection.
I'm still here.
You're still here, yeah. Okay.
I'm still here.
And you can still hear me.
Yes.
Okay. I asked Jan Wolf to come in, please.
Hi, it's Jan Wolf.
Jan Wolf, yeah.
Jan Wolf, hello. I want to thank Helen very much for bringing James Aldridge to my attention. I hadn't heard of him, and I'm working my way through Heroes of the Empty View. Now, it's interesting that he was friends with E.M. Forster. This is a deep literary connection, and that E.M. Forster's known very well for his Bon Mot's Only Connect, which is what Aldridge does very well through class connections. I can imagine him being cancelled all too easily these days. There will be something in any book that would go for. I can imagine him being repressed, which is why I possibly haven't come across him. The class politics are too clear, and so is the question of the national liberation struggle. It's very clear. And although these days the woke brigade or the wokeness would be anti-colonial and state that, it's not a class position. And I'm assuming that Aldridge is very familiar with the politics of the national question, which the left isn't today. And I can imagine his frustration with 70s and 80s sectarianism and divisions and so on, which lets all sorts of other crap come through. But I wonder if Helen could say something about that, is Aldridge's view of the national question. Now, he wouldn't state that because he's too good a writer. He's not a didactic writer. But it seems to be coming through, especially in the book I'm reading, Heroes of the Empty View.
Thanks, Jan. First of all, I mean, he wasn't friends with E.M. Forster. He wanted E.M. Forster. The thing he wrote about E.M. Forster was simply saying he deserves more acknowledgement in the socialist firmament, as it were, because of some of the stuff he wrote in the 1920s. What his view on the national question is. Thank you. That's a very interesting point. I haven't really considered that in any great depth. I mean, he was very well versed in Marxism. I would assume he's read Lenin, whoever it was he wrote it. Is it Lenin or Stalin on the national question? I would assume he read it. And it certainly doesn't come across in his novels. It also doesn't really come across in any of his writings, in his political writings. He was against the common market. I know that because he wrote a letter to the Times against the common market. So whether that was affected by his attitude towards the national question, so that would be one point. Sorry, there was another question you asked, Jan. Oh, just about the national question.
Well, it's about to write well politically, you cannot be didactic. So he wouldn't have written overtly about that. But
No.
that can even come through in children's work, which I'm very interested to read.
I mean, he was in his early novels. It's quite interesting. He is, I mean, he's an Australian and he settles in Britain. And in his early work, when he describes the British, particularly in his wartime novels, he described there's a constant refrain about how reserved the British are, and it's almost like he comes up against the British almost for the first time, and he's constantly on about, oh, they're reserved, they're rather cold, they're cool, you know, and he's not particularly sympathetic to them. But in a book called The Last Exile, he's very critical, particularly of the Australian leader Mingott or Menzies. So he's obviously got some, I think he's got, you know, in certainly the earlier part of his life, you get some sense in Australian nationalism. But I think he is very much yes, I mean, I just couldn't say about the national question, but I think you're quite right to the extent that he would put class first and foremost. So he would have been against. He would have been against on that basis a lot of the what we call identity politics of today. He would have been opposed to that. I would suspect. I mean, it's very difficult to say really, because you see, in 1981, Labour Monthly closed. The death of Palm Dutt really ended, you know, brought to a close Labour Monthly. And of course, by the 1990s, all of the previous outlets it had disappeared. The World Marxist Review. He wrote in his Vestia, he wrote in it Moscow News. So those outlets had disappeared. So I have absolutely no knowledge after the 1990s, apart from what one can pick up from childhood novels. I have no idea of what his views were. So it does become the speculation.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Can I bring in now, please, David Margolis?
Yeah. Thank you. Helen, I enjoyed this lecture a great deal, and thank you very much for it. I had heard of The Diplomat. In fact, it was a book in the family home, and I carry it around with me from move to move, and I think I will now get to reading it. I mean,
it's very long.
Yes, and I'm a slow reader, but it sounds like a very good antidote to the most abstract and removed kind of academic Marxism. And so I'm looking forward to that. So thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for I've been reading your material on writing the revolution. Yeah.
Are there, Logie Burrow would like to come in. Logie, unmute yourself, please.
Yes, okay, thanks. Very quickly, fascinating talk about somebody I am disgracefully ignorant about. Presumably you can only tease out any line from him during the last 24 years of his life, because you say he died in 2015, about the collapse of the Soviet Union and really the collapse of a lot of his world.
It would be so interesting to know. It would be very, very interesting. I mean, this is why I sort of classify him as a type of communist. I mean, I don't think he was not the sort of communist who would have left in 1956. He did not condemn the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in '68. He was opposed to Solidarność in Poland in 1981. So he, I think it would have absolutely been a devastating moment in his life. I should sort of say that in the 1980s, his wife, Dina Aldridge, was the chair of the Society for Cultural Relations. And he went to the Soviet Union a lot with her. And in fact, he organized an exhibition of Soviet children's books in the 1980s. It went on. He was a great admirer of Soviet children's books, and he went on an expedition. He had an exhibition that toured around Britain at that time. I would imagine it was a terrific blow, and I think for the type of communist he was, I suspect it would have been a sort of bewilderment. What has happened? It would be a searching for answers, a searching for understanding, but otherwise I have absolutely no idea. And I saw somebody ask in the chat, are there any archives? And again, I don't know. I don't know of any.
Thank you so much for thinking out loud. Yeah. I'll now mute.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Helen, either in the chat or by raising your hand electronically, or by switching your camera on and raising your real physical hand? I accept all these invitations. I see Christian Hoiberg in the chat has picked up on the remark you made about the parallels between James Aldridge and Jack Lindsay. Do you think this is this a theme you can expand on, or is it? He
must have been a friend of Jack Lindsay. I mean, I don't know for sure, but he must have been a friend. Him and Jack Lindsay collaborated on a book called Such is Life. And Jack Lindsay contributed a piece from Betrayed Spring, and Aldridge contributed. That was where I think that's where his piece, The Last Inch, came in. The Last Inch was made into a film in the Soviet Union, and I think also Aldridge wrote an introduction to The Report from the Gallows by Julius Fučík. Now, I think I pronounced it right. Julius Fučík was a Czech journalist who became part of the resistance in Czechoslovakia and was arrested by the Gestapo and tortured. And he managed to smuggle his notes. He kept notes about his torture and his experiences at the hand of the Gestapo, and they were smuggled out by a sympathetic Czech guard. And it appeared in a book in 1951 called A Report from the Gallows, and Aldridge wrote the introduction to it. And I think he was probably asked to do that by Jack Lindsay, who I think was responsible for bringing the book out. So I think he was a friend of Jack Lindsay. Now, Jack Lindsay had a very checkered history within the Communist Party. I mean, obviously, as far as I know, Aldridge wasn't in the Communist Party. I mean, I don't know if he was. There are no signs of it. where he would have stood in relation to Jack Lindsay, I don't know. Jack Lindsay, I think in one of his, he wrote a book called The Crisis in Marxism, which I haven't really read very well, but I think he became very much a, he very much saw Gramsci as having the better approach to Marxism than what you might call orthodox Marxism. Whether Aldridge followed that, I do not know. Let me think, was that the question? Does that answer the question a bit? But he certainly knew Jack Lindsay, and I think that they must have been friends. I mean, sometimes I get the impression, to be honest, with Aldridge, that he must have felt quite a few of the friends he'd had, the contacts he'd had, falling away, not only by death, but also by ideological changes from the 1980s. I suspect that might be, you pick up that some sort of a sense of being this falling away of friendships and colleagues and collaborators. And Jack Lindsay might have been part of that, but I don't know.
Thanks. Any final questions for Helen? I think we've worked quite hard for last hour and a bit. Any other questions, points, observations, promises to read Aldridge?
I mean, that's really my aim, is that people do start reading him. I think he's well worth reading, and you can get an awful lot of you get quite a few of the books on Internet Archive, which I don't know if any of you know, but it's a great resource, Internet Archive, and it's got quite a lot of his books, quite a lot of his writings are on there. And the other thing I think, we can't discuss it now, but it's a big question. But there's a whole question of socialist realism and Aldridge's relationship to socialist realism, his knowledge of it. And I think he definitely was very aware of it. And I think that's another area. But it's a big area to get into. But I think it's a very important area.
Okay, then. Anybody else like to come in? This is your last chance. Please raise your electronic or physical hand. Otherwise, okay. Well, in that case, I'd like to ask you all to join in a round of applause for Helen for a very good, fascinating paper. We can all undertake to read at least one book by James Aldridge